So we are here today in Ottawa, Canada, with Rumina Velshi, the president of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. Thank you so much for inviting me up here. This is awesome.
Oh, Brett, thank you.
Yeah.
I was looking forward to this.
And it's good to see you again. So, last time we met was at the RIC conference, right?
That's right, in Washington.
That was in my neck of the woods.
Right,
yeah.
yes.
So now we're in your territory. We'll see how it goes this time.
Hey, the weather's better. Well, marginally better,
It was super nice
It
when
was
I landed
actually
here. I
very
thought
nice
Canada
there.
was like a frozen tundra.
Yeah, 8 months of the year, though.
Where are you from originally?
So it's a bit complicated. I was born in Uganda, East Africa.
In Uganda?
Yes. My forefathers are of Indian origin.
Okay.
And we emigrated to Canada in the 1970s. Came as refugees then, yes.
And when you came here, how old were you at the time?
I was 17.
Okay, so you had already kind of like lived abroad, developed a worldly experience, if I can throw that on you.
Well, different experience. And so, yes, I was born in Uganda, which was a former British colony. So some advantages to that at least my education was based on the British school system, so it was more portable. My forefathers, as I told you, were of Indian origin. So still the same very conservative, traditional values that I was brought up in. And we came here as refugees in the 70s. I was hadn't finished my high school as yet, so almost at the cusp of having to decide what I wanted to do with my life. So it was a pretty critical moment in my life when we came over here.
And what was important to you then? As a 17-year-old coming to a new country, you were deciding what you were going to study. What weighed in on that decision?
Well, a number of things. Having come as refugees, well, maybe I'll take a step back. I told you we were brought up in the British school system, so I'd finished my O-levels and had done a year of my A-levels. So my education was portable. And when I came here, came in February. University would be starting in September, so I had to make some fairly quick decisions. We had come as refugees, so there were a lot of financial considerations. But what was very critical for my family and for me was the importance of education. And the one thing that we realized coming here as refugees, frankly, it's only your education that really comes with you and none of your material goods. And I come from a family of 4 girls, and that need to be financially independent was quite ingrained from a very young age. And so a priority for me was to make sure that I got the credits I needed to get into university, finding a high school that would accept me for a few months of the year, and having to decide what I actually wanted to study that would give me the financial independence and yet do something that I really wanted to do.
And that was?
So it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy because I come from a family where we have people who've gone through university. It's been mostly as doctors and accountants, and I knew I didn't want to do that. I'd always been good at math and physics, but I really wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. And when I met with the guidance counselors, they weren't terribly helpful, and they didn't exactly veer me in any one direction. But it was, well, you could probably do whatever you want to, but maybe you want to consider teaching. But what really helped me make my decision was the guidance counselor gave me a university program and said, well, study this over the weekend and see a description of the different programs and see what appeals to you. And I knew maybe teaching, but I wanted something more practical and more applied. And as I was going through the course descriptions, the one that really grabbed my eye was that of civil engineering. One that I liked the description. It had application of the kinds of areas that I was interested in. It had both office work and outdoor field work. And the symbol that was used to describe civil engineering was that of a suspension bridge, which had an appeal on many fronts, both as a symbol of humankind's ingenuity to overcome challenges, but all the other metaphorical symbols that it represents. And then that same weekend, there was a newspaper article on the Brooklyn Bridge. And it talked about, it was kind of the eighth wonder of the world and all the drama that went with it on not having enough public confidence and having elephants march on the bridge to build that. But the thing that really struck me about that story was the project manager, the project engineer, had become quite ill. And his wife, Emily Ribling, had stepped in to finish the project. And I said, I want to be just like her. And I'm so glad that I didn't have all these other societal considerations on, well, maybe that's not quite the norm. But it was almost like the universe was talking to me. Here was the program, civil engineering, and here's a suspension bridge. And that's how I decided to go into engineering and into civil engineering.
It's important that people have role models that inspire them. I'm sure you've carried that through your career as well.
Very much so. I don't know if Emily Ribling was a role model. I mean, she was in that she did inspire me. I didn't know any engineer when I decided to go into engineering. And I picked the University of Toronto because there were enough changes in my life, and this would mean staying at home, and was also financially a bit more acceptable. But I remember that first day, and I think in all engineering schools, and probably still today, and I looked around, and there were 3 women in a class of about 108. And the dean saying, look to the person to your right and look to the person to the left, and one of you 3 will not be here when you graduate. And that is what had happened. But it wasn't until then that I realized that engineering was not popular amongst young women.
Yeah, you broke the mold.
Well, I don't know if I broke it, but I was one of the earlier ones. And
certainly in the nuclear world.
In the nuclear world, for sure, and certainly in the operations side of the nuclear world in Ontario. I graduated in 1978, and I joined Ontario Hydro, a public electrical utility. It was Ontario Hydro then, and it's now Ontario Power Generation. And those were the heydays for nuclear. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with our nuclear facilities, but we had new reactors that had come online recently. There were many that were being constructed. So the Pickering A unit, the 4 units were online. The Bruce A units, some were online. There were some under construction. Pickering B units were under construction. Darlington was on the engineering stage. There were nuclear plants at the design stage, early design stage. I mean, it was boom time like we haven't seen since. So it was really an area of great opportunities.
And when was this? This was in the 80s?
Early 80s.
Now, what contributed, do you think, to this sense of wanting to build so much nuclear? Because a lot of what I try to do is I try to track down how can we create that again. And sometimes I think, at least in the U.S., the narrative has become, oh, well, after 3 Mile Island, people didn't want nuclear anymore. And I don't agree with that. There might have been a bit of a coincidence with timing in the U.S. and the maturity of our industry, but plenty of places around the world after 3 Mile Island, like you were just saying, boom, 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 let's build.
So it was boom, boom, boom before 3 Mile Island. And so the last units were built were the Darlington units, which had already been underway before 3 Mile Island. But it was generally a sense of this is a Canadian technology, it's can-do technology. And it's the visionaries who really saw it through. And I mean, I had been involved in both in the engineering, in the construction, the commissioning, the full cycle of a nuclear facility. And in those days, from the start of construction to the unit coming online was like about 5 years.
Amazing.
I know.
Amazing.
And this is the technology of those days. And
right.
5 years. And then by the time it got to Darlington, it was more like 8 years. And who knows what it will be today.
Okay, so you all right, but you were there. I mean, you had experience in every aspect of this. You saw what could happen in 5 years. Maybe I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, but what's going wrong? How come we can't just replicate whatever the brilliant engineers in the 80s did?
Oh my, if only we knew, why not? But I'll tell you, for Darlington, which were the last units that were constructed in Ontario, where the 5 years had now become 8 years and a bit over. I remember the construction manager, Hank Zuzak, at the time telling me a lot had to do with rework because of regulatory requirements. And I've always remembered that. And I can't speak to details on exactly what they were, or maybe they had started constructing before the engineering was complete. That always seems to be a problem, and hadn't taken into consideration all the regulatory requirements. And now the regulator is saying, well, you're really not meeting our requirements. But there was a lot of rework that was happening as they were constructing. And then my last project when I was with Ontario Power Generation before I retired from there was looking at new technologies and getting ready for new build. And this was in the early part of this century. And it was a great project.
And what kind of technologies were you looking at?
Well, we were looking at all the ones that were available. There was the advanced can-do reactor, the AP1000, the EPR, the Japanese.
What's the advanced can-do? We don't hear much about that.
Yeah,
in the States.
so it was. It didn't go too far because they really couldn't get a market for that. But it
was it going to be big, small?
It was big. It was about 1,000 megawatts.
Okay, a big guy.
And it was bigger than the 640. And there was EPR. There was the Japanese, the Korean. I mean, the ones that we see around, and we assessed all of those to see. Ontario was thinking of building maybe up to 4,800 megawatts at the Darlington site. And we completed the technology assessment and tried to price it. But then there really wasn't a demand for electricity that would justify the investment at that time.
Right. In some ways, sometimes nuclear is a bit of a victim of its own success. It's so good at delivering so much power that it almost eats into, there isn't much of a market remaining for it to sell into after it does its job well.
Well, except we do have an aging fleet. Now, as a regulator, I don't get involved in energy policy decisions. So, but, during my time in the industry, when I was on the operations side of it, we were having units being shut down and replacing them with additional nuclear plants. And with the decision not to invest in new nuclear, the utilities have looked at seeing how they can extend the lives of the existing fleet.
And Canada is kind of like a role model in terms of the refurbishment projects and being able to extend the life.
That is right.
They made a decision and then executed on it.
That is, and we've got, yes, and so let me take a couple of steps back on this. I mean, it's because of extending these lives, bringing nuclear plants that had been shut down back online, that Ontario has been able to get off coal. And
right, Ontario is like carbon-free. If Ontario was a country, it would be the most cleanest country in the world.
One of the top 3 cleanest countries in the world, yes. And it was because of the nuclear power plants. I mean, there was some renewables, but the bulk of it was certainly with the Bruce A units coming online and the refurbishments that were undertaken.
That's amazing.
That Ontario has been able to get to where it has, yes.
And so what was your transition then between private industry and coming here to the regulator?
So I left the private industry in around 2008. And after a few years, I was asked if I'd be interested in serving on the tribunal as a commission member.
What's a tribunal? We don't have that.
So the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is like the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and it's a quasi-judicial tribunal, but it's like the NRC, and we have a commission of up to 7 members. The president and CEO is the full-time member, and then up to 6 part-time members. Make all the licensing decisions, approve all the regulations and requirements. And so I was asked if I was interested in that, because when I left OPG, because of my employment contract and so on, I couldn't work in the industry for a few years. But being the regulator was okay. And
probably preferred.
well, no, it actually met with opposition from all quarters, from industry because they were worried I knew where all the skeletons were hidden, from the non-governmental organizations because they thought I was too close to industry. And I was the first commission member who had been in industry. So there was some concern.
But you were the best. They wanted the best in the role, and they found the best, and they brought you in, even given those perception challenges. Perhaps.
Well, I'd like to think so. And I was brought in because of my background and my expertise. And I do remember the first licensing hearing I went to. It was for the Darlington site. And there were many interveners who suggested I recuse myself because of potential conflict of interest. Interveners from the United States as well.
What are we doing? Putting our noses where they don't belong.
I won't touch that. But in any case, the decision was that I had been brought in because of my expertise. And as you know, I mean, this is a rather nuanced industry. A lot of jargon, a lot of complexities, and one can get bamboozled quite easily.
Yes.
And so having someone on the commission who could get under some of the concerns or issues that were being raised and probe a bit further, it soon became evident that that was a good thing to have on the commission. So here I am.
When you joined, what were the big issues of the day? Actually, maybe let me ask this a little bit of a different way. What is the division of responsibilities between someone on the commission and the types of decisions they have to make and the guidance that they set towards what the agency does versus the career staff who are more in like an operational role within the agency?
So there is quite the firewall between the commission and the staff. The commission really don't have any dealings with staff other than in a public forum. So all discussions happen in a public arena. The staff are advisors to the commission.
And then so how do you set policy then? Is it only, if you don't get to like work with them on like a day-to-day and have those conversations and kind of like get up next to their desk and say, all right, what are we going to do here? How do you set policy? Is it only through written proclamations, or how does it work?
Yeah, no, so they are written submissions, but a lot of it is public proceedings where they are, the licensees are there, staff are there, intervener communities are there, and there are oral presentations and submissions made. Commissions can ask, challenge, question what's being presented, and hear different perspectives before making a decision. But yes, as I said, there's clear separation between staff and the commission. And that's to maintain the independence of the commission.
That's to maintain the independence of the commission. Got it. And that is just a structure that the Canadian government set up when they created the agency?
That is correct.
And was that modeled, I know the NRC was created in 1974. Was it just modeled based off of how the NRC set up this idea of a commission and then an agency?
So the CNSC is a bit older than the NRC.
So we stole it from you.
Probably. But yes, that is the model. Now, I'm in a slightly unique spot in that I'm also the head of the organization and I'm the head of the commission. So I do wear two hats. And but when I am presiding over commission proceedings, I am there as the head of the commission.
Got it. And what kind of things, let's go through some of the highlights. What comes to your guys' attention that's really like this is a tough situation, we need to think about it, we need to, bring in all the evidence. We need to consult with experts. We need some time to like really just make some decisions here. What are some of those types of
So
issues?
let me pick a few examples. I joined the commission soon after Fukushima.
Okay.
So the timing was, we were really looking at many things, very fundamental issues, but particularly around emergency management and readiness, but our regulatory framework. And so those were very interesting discussions at that time. So that was one. We also, during my first term as a commission member, we had an anonymous letter sent. It was kind of like a whistleblowing letter that there may be, that there were some CNSE staff who were withholding information from commission members. And that was discussed in a public forum, and we had an investigation and look into it, and that had understandably got a fair bit of media attention as well. So that was a pretty sensitive issue that we dealt with. The life extension discussions around the Bruce and Pickering units to have them operate. And some of it is just the language that we use. We would use terms like end of life. And now they want to come and extend the life. Well,
the nuclear community and their language skills really leaves much to be desired.
It's not terribly helpful at all. But it was really the ability to extend the operating lives of these facilities. There was a lot of public angst about it and concerns.
And how do you gain public trust? I know that's very important to you. What are some of the strategies that you personally, but then also that you kind of carry through the agency to be able to uphold that public trust?
And so you're absolutely right. I think having public trust and strengthening public trust is probably one of my top 3 priorities in this organization. I saw that as a commission member. And so the way I believe to build that public trust, one is around transparency. And the commission has come a long ways, even in the 7-8 years that I've been involved in what is made available to the public. So whereas before they would have to ask and then get reams of paper, now it's all available online. So anything that a commission member sees, it's easily, readily accessible to members of the public. But the public isn't a homogeneous group. So there's some members of the public who want assurance that it's safe and you, the regulator, are doing what needs to be done. Give me something that I can understand easily, readily, in an accessible manner. So that part, that whole communication in easy, readily understandable terms is a key part. But then we have the more sophisticated interveners, members of the public, civil society organizations, who have the expertise, the capacity to actually do their own independent analysis and assessments. And they want the raw data, they want results to themselves verify and evaluate. And how do we make sure that they have not only the information, but how do we help them build the capacity to do that? And as a commission member, getting that perspective I have found to be extremely valuable. And it has actually led to us making better informed decisions. And how do we encourage that and support that? So there is the transparency part. There is also helping build the capacity. So one of the things we do here at the CNSC is we have a participant funding program. So we actually provide funds to our different interveners for them to make submissions. The other part, so transparency is one, support is one, the other one is engagement. And how do we create the right processes that optimizes the kind of engagement at proceedings? But I've also served on another tribunal, another regulator, the Ontario Energy Board, which sets the electricity and gas prices for Ontario. And that regulator operates a little differently, but it's got certain practices that we at the CNSC could adopt and learn from.
Like what?
So one of the things they have is what's called technical conferences. What happens at the CNSC proceedings is we'll have staff and licensees and interveners, but all the questioning happens through the commission members. They can't cross-examine each other. And I know that there is a level of frustration with that. And part of it is we want our processes to be very accessible. The OEB processes tend to be a lot more legalistic, and they'll have lawyers represent them. But
OEB?
Ontario Energy Board.
Okay.
Right, the other regulator that I started with. Right, the acronyms again. But they have this forum called a technical conference, which in our case would be staff, licensees, specialists, members of the public, civil society organizations who have a special interest in that, who can get together and they can ask each other questions and get answers to, and especially for something very technical where they feel they need to have that dialogue amongst themselves. I think it can be extremely helpful. And then what comes out of that, because this is probably maybe all transcripted, but at least what comes out of it can then get presented to the commission so that the commission can use that in order to deliberate and make its decision. So we're looking at how do we improve our processes. We're also looking at creating an advisory forum. It's something that I've learned from the UK. They have an NGO advisory forum. And the CNSC did have it at one time, early on, stopped it for some reason or the other. But I think that would, again, be helpful for me. Then we have our Indigenous communities. And the CNSC, as the representative of the Crown, has the duties of the Crown to fulfill around that, around consultation, around engagement, around accommodation. And in there, the CNSC has done some great work, again, areas that we can do better at. So one of the things we introduced this year, this is an oral tradition. In some of our proceedings, we only accept written submissions, but for the Indigenous communities, we now allow them to make oral submissions. And again, a better way for them to get engaged in the processes. So when you talk about public trust, I think those are some things that we are doing and are trying to get better at. And certainly learning from others and how they do that. One of the things we don't do well at the moment is how do we measure how well we're doing when it comes to public trust. So we're looking at ways of doing that more objectively. When I was in Finland recently, and my counterpart there was sharing some public opinion polls, and one of the questions asked in this poll was, so who do you trust the most for getting information around nuclear and the industry and safety and so on? And the regulator was right up there. I don't know what Canadians would say about the CNSC, but I think it's something we need to measure and see how we can get better at.
Yes. Well, Canadians, as far as I know them, are always very polite, so they'd probably just say whatever's nicest on that forum. Or is that just an American
No, I think as a general statement, that's probably not too far off. But
as the government, sometimes maybe you feel...
No, we do hear strong concerns. Generally, and I think it's probably very similar around the world, for communities that live close to nuclear facilities, they're very comfortable with it.
Yeah.
Have high confidence in that. As you move further afield, partly it's because they don't know, and partly it's the sources of information they get, maybe not the most objective, maybe a lot more sensational. And frankly, we probably collectively don't put enough effort at better education and information. So you may get a slightly different response. And I know when I got appointed to this role, I had many people, do we have nuclear power in Canada? I didn't know that. So, there's even those who outside probably Ontario and New Brunswick who may feel that.
You know what? I laugh a little bit, but on the other hand, I think it's an incredible opportunity. You can't expect everyone to know everything about all the infrastructure. Hell, I don't even know where my water comes from or how that works. But I think that's one of the things that sometimes the nuclear community gets a little bit on the defensive about people's possible negative sentiment towards nuclear. But then I go around and I realize just how many people don't even know what nuclear energy is. And that's an opportunity to bring people onto the side of nuclear, just to show them how amazing it is and not let them get clouded by a negative perception. It's almost that people not knowing about it, they're almost like blank slates. And it means that no matter how many people you think are out there that don't like nuclear, just because they're the most vocal doesn't mean they're the most numerous.
Right, and our role as a regulator is not to promote nuclear.
I know, you leave that to me, I'll promote it.
But mine is to make sure that there is factual information that's readily and easily available.
Yep. A lot's been changing over these last few years. In the US, we've seen like 50 different startup technologies, people trying to bring new reactors to the market. When I was at Chalk River, I saw, Chalk River was like, yeah, come on here, we'll host a small reactor. I know Canada has their SMR roadmap. How does the Commission interact with some of these new technologies? What do you see coming down the pipeline? Are you the first people that some of these new nuclear companies come to and say, hey, we have an idea, we'd like to run it by you?
So I think the regulator plays a very critical role in this, and I think the CNSC is extremely well positioned to fulfill a very critical role when it comes to new technologies and being in a state of readiness for that. So when we talk about SMRs and the roadmap that you mentioned, we offer a service called a vendor design review service, where vendors can come and submit their technologies to us. We can assess them, and it helps us understand what's being proposed, but also for us to identify what any big showstoppers may be when it comes to licensing of those technologies.
And how does this vendor design review work? Who's paying for it? How long does it take? What's the basics?
So there are 3 phases to it, and the vendor comes and makes a submission, and they pay for it. They pay for the regulator's time, and the first phase is a more generic review, and then it gets more detailed as you pass through that. So we've actually got 11 vendors that are going through that. They're at different stages. Our regulatory framework in Canada is, I think it kind of lends itself because it's technology neutral. So you can get different designs coming in.
Is it risk-informed as well?
It is also risk-informed.
Okay, that seems to me like the critical one.
Absolutely. It's risk-informed, it's technology neutral, and it's very performance-based as opposed to being very prescriptive. So we would say, here are the outcomes we expect. You come and tell us how you're going to meet that, as opposed to we expect you to do this, this, and that, which allows them flexibility, lends itself to innovation. So
and is the ultimate outcome, hey, let's just make sure nobody gets hurt? Is that just the number one rule, that everything kind of falls up to?
Absolutely. Protecting the environment, public, and the workers.
And, so I've heard
and meeting our international obligations when it comes to security and safeguards. Important, yes.
We're not worried about Canada smuggling out nuclear material.
But we still make sure the security and safeguards.
Yes.
I want to make sure.
Check.
Yes, covered it.
Okay, so let me ask you though, because one of the things that I've struggled with a little bit, a lot of people talk about, I meet with all the reactor designers, and a lot of them say, hey, we want to go to Canada because they've got this flexible, technology agnostic approach, and we think that we can get through the system cheaper and faster, and that's what we need to, because we've got investors, and we're a private company, and we don't have billions of dollars that we can throw in this. So we need to actually make it happen, and so Canada looks like a great option from that perspective. One of the litmus tests that I always like to run, though, and I'm going to run it by you now and see what you say, is let's say that I were to say I've got a mine shaft that goes a mile underground. Could I bring to you a model that says, hey, I've got a 1 megawatt little trigger type reactor, but I want it for electricity. I'm going to drop it in a mine shaft a mile underground, pour a bunch of concrete on top. Can we get this done in a month? It's not going to take a month to run the calculations on radionuclide dispersion out of that scenario. Is that a proposal that someone could get through your system, which is risk informed and technology agnostic? Could they get it through in a month?
Most unlikely.
Why?
So, so first of all, we're very specific at what our requirements are on what we want before we can make a decision. A month is just, it's hard for anything to come through. So I think, but if your question is, can one do that in a reasonable time given the risks involved? That principle is enshrined and ingrained in how we approach it. So it's flexible and it's risk-informed, and the level of effort is commensurate with that. So if that's the kind of reassurance the vendor needs, then yes, we provide that. A month wouldn't. And also part of our process is that, as I told you earlier, is to engage with different stakeholders, and that takes time. And these are a lot of first-of-a-kind technologies. So while we as the regulator don't want to be a bottleneck, we'll never compromise safety.
Right.
And we just want to make sure that at the end of the day, we have not only done a great job in assessing and evaluating, but we can demonstrate that people should have confidence in what we have done. One of the things we're doing when you talk about new technologies and readiness, and something that I frankly learned from my earlier life when we were assessing different technologies, and when we were trying to price the technologies or cost them, the piece that was assigned to regulatory uncertainty, that particular risk, carried a very high cost in your overall project cost.
Yeah, and you mentioned it before too, when we talked about if there's regulatory changes that might affect construction.
And so that's one thing we're trying to do, make sure that our expectations are clear and that we have them up front.
Is there like a lock-in process? Would you guys guarantee a vendor that at the start of construction that no rules will be changed before the end of construction?
So it's not so much as no rules will change, because this is, hey, it's a dynamic environment and we may learn something, but they would be justified in doing so. And I mean, we did that after Fukushima, right? I mean, we had to go and ask our current licensees to make changes because it was driven by some of the learnings from that. So that caveat, but we're not going to change requirements only because now we have done some other assessments. So one is bringing that greater certainty up front, providing these services so that they get a bit more reassurance that they're going to have what kind of a ride they're going to get through the licensing process. The third part is that of collaboration. And one part is with our fellow international regulators, because many of these technologies are being considered around the world. And the United States is a key partner for us in that. And we can certainly leverage our resources, the information, our research and assessments. And it was just last month that Chairman Svinicki and I jointly announced that we would work in even greater, closer collaboration when it comes to this. Ideally, you know what I'd like? I'd like us to have a uniform set of requirements.
Okay, so I was just going to ask. So maybe not a uniform set of requirements, because maybe that would scare some people like the risk-informed technology. Right. But I guess what I was just going to ask, and I think what you're getting to, has there ever been the discussion of reciprocity?
Right. Right, and so this discussion with Chairman Svinicki, and having preliminary discussions with the UK as well, is around that. Is if we have done an assessment on something, or they have done, the NRC's done on something, and if we have looked at the process and we've done our quality checks on that we're reasonably confident, why would we not accept their results, and vice versa? And we're there. We're there. We've done it with other things. We've done it with transportation, for instance. A flask that has been assessed and certified in one jurisdiction, another would accept it. And so I think we're almost at the cusp of getting that, certainly in some areas. There is always the sovereignty of the regulator that one shouldn't forget. And at the end of the day, we're all answerable to our own peoples. And so that always stays, but there are so many opportunities to streamline, make it the process more efficient and better, with better decisions that come out if we work closer together. And so the commitment is there to make that happen.
Has there ever been a conversation? So I come from the drone industry, and there was a while where there was just one set of rules for drones, whether it was risk-informed or prescriptive, almost didn't matter. It applied to drones of all shapes and sizes. And then over time, the regulator decided, you know what, we're driving our industry out of business because a 1 kilogram drone does not pose the same inherent risk as a 1,000 kilogram drone. And on top of that, even though our staff is tasked to apply risk-informed regulations, culturally, you know what, like they want to do the best job that they can do. They're going to ask as many questions as they can ask, and that means they ask the same amount of questions and require the same amount of proof for the 1 kilogram drone as the 1,000 kilogram drone. Even though they're applying a risk-informed process, it still costs the same however many billions of dollars to get through. I'm almost wondering, has there been conversation, and what do you think about taking a similar approach to the nuclear industry, where, yes, you got to follow the rules, risk-informed, technology agnostic, but we create a safe space for smaller reactors where our staff has almost cultural permission to say, you know what, we don't need to spend 10 years looking at this. It's less than a megawatt. We know the total source term exposure under any circumstance is going to be, below a threshold. That could be a hazard to human health. We're going to put them through some process, but we're going to let everyone at the organization know it's not the same thing as a gigawatt scale reactor. Does that conversation emerge at all?
All the time. And it's not just based on reactor size. I mean, we run into that on probably just about every regulatory decision that comes in front of us. How do we make sure, as you said, it's risk informed, which then what comes out of that is what's the level of effort that goes with that. And so when it comes to new technologies, I mean, besides the fact that these are first of kind and they'll probably require a greater level of scrutiny, but never losing sight of what is the risk that we're trying to manage. And I'm going to draw a similar analogy. I really do like your drones analogy, and I think it's one that I'm going to be using for future discussions because I think that's a really good one. But, in Canada, we've just recently passed new legislation around environmental assessments. It's called our new Impact Assessment Act, where for new projects, they would go through a much more extensive assessment, so not just on environment, but on a whole bunch of other factors. But in order to determine which projects would go through this more extensive review, there was a lot of discussion on what's the threshold, what's the risk level, and how does that get reflected in that. So when it came to nuclear projects, the size of the nuclear reactors, whether it's megawatts or same with uranium mines, it was reflected in that. So those kinds of conversations happen in a plethora of factors and initiatives, yes.
Other issues that are important to you here, STEM education for women, I know that's another top one.
Right. So one of the reasons why I took on this role is because I think it gives me a great platform. It's been kind of a lifelong objective of mine, given my background as always kind of being one of the first ones or one of the few ones doing different things. And over the years, I've seen change, but not a significant amount of change. It's been modest at best, minimal, more likely. So even today, and I'll talk about the nuclear industry, maybe 20 to 25% are women, and a predominant number of them, frankly, are more in the non-technical side of the business. So after that, who knows? One of our universities, that is a feedstock for the nuclear industry. I was very disturbed only this morning to read that 10% of their undergraduate engineering class is women. So, as I said, this platform, because I think for this industry to be ready for the future, to be appealing to the younger generation, it needs to be seen to be more diverse. It needs to be more welcoming to different perspectives, and it needs. And one thing that has been proven unequivocally is having greater diversity, and by that I also mean having more women, is better for business as well. It's better for the bottom line. It's a smart decision. It's the right decision, and so I have taken whatever opportunities I can to make a case for why we need greater diversity, why we need greater balance within our workforce, and bring the brightest and the best to the industry, and that making sure that we're attracting women and enabling them and supporting them to thrive and succeed. So it's not only just getting them in, but it's retaining them as well. And one of the concerns I often hear, and if you look at the symbol that was used for this year's International Women's Day, was that of a scale, as it was around gender balance. And what that to me, and what's been said to me is, well, what you're then saying is to bring women up, the men need to come down. One has to lose for the other to win. And I think I think we need to change that whole structure. And the analogy I like, which I think works much better, is that of a candle. That if you use one candle to light another candle, you've got twice as much light, and the initial candle has not lost any of its power.
I love it.
And so if we use the same thing about bringing more women in, it'll be lighting up an entire room. When you empower women, everyone benefits. And I think it's just a much better analogy that you're not taking away power from the men, you're just making it a better workplace and a better world for everyone.
Rumina, as we wrap up here, I mean, listen, in your career, you've demonstrated technical excellence, you've demonstrated leadership. You're one of the premier figures that the nuclear industry has to really carry us forward. And I know as a regulator, you're not allowed to advocate for anything, fine. But if you could put on your crystal ball magic hat and just kind of look out into the future of nuclear and tell us what you see, maybe you could shed some light on that.
Well, I see actually two scenarios, I mean, maybe two extremes. But there is a part of me, and maybe it's being a regulator, one's always the pessimist, but it's also, this is a reality, is that we could have another Germany happening here and cease and desist and shut down all nuclear facilities. And I would not preclude that as also a likely scenario. So I read this morning that June last month was the hottest month in recorded history. So if nuclear is seen and is accepted as a viable option to fight climate change, I see incredible growth and opportunities. And frankly, I think it's inevitable, but don't know. So I do see that. I think the most exciting times for this industry are the ones ahead of us. So as a regulator, I want to make sure that we're agile enough to respond to both.
Rumina Velshi, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.